Okay, hi everyone joining us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. I'm Vassy Kapelos. This is a special Power and Politics discussion on the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'm here with Colin Robertson, Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, former Canadian diplomat, and member of the team that negotiated the Canada-US Free Trade and the original NAFTA. Nice to see you. Thanks so much. The CBC's Katie Simpson will be joining us shortly from Washington, where, of course, we all know she's been staking out the trade talks there. But we're here to answer your questions. What do you want to know about these negotiations or anything to do with NAFTA, President Trump? Post your questions in the comment sections on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as you can. So I'm going to start off with one that I received once I posted the notice of the Facebook Live this morning, and it's from someone whose acronym is Trudeau's eyebrows. But their question is interesting. Put another way, do you think impeachment is imminent, and is that of Donald Trump, and is that factoring into our NAFTA negotiation stance? Why or why not?
Well, Trudeau's eyebrows, I do not think impeachment is imminent, but I think that we'll wait and see what happens in the midterms. I do think if the Democrats win the House, again, open question, then I think we could well see scenarios. Much will depend on the Mueller investigation and where he comes down, and if that report is out, although it's not looking, that may not be till next year. But I think there would be enough, there's probably enough to give a democratically controlled House the ammunition to begin discussions around, or at least to have committee hearings around impeachment, because as you know, it's the House that does the impeachment, it's the Senate that actually decides. Senate's another tougher issue. I think it could well be like with the Clinton administration when Bill Clinton was impeached, but the Senate did not find there was sufficient proof to move forward.
Do you think there's any connection, or are you looking and watching for any connection between what we've seen unfold over the last 48 hours? And I'm talking about the op-ed and the Woodward book and the sort of allegations contained in them. Is there any chance that impacts the way these negotiations are going just down the street where Chrystia Freeland and Bob Lighthizer are?
I think it complicates things for the United States. It just adds another level of uncertainty and pressure. From a Canadian perspective, this may work to our benefit because Mr. Trump has been very good at clearing away the table and bringing something new in, but these rockets keep coming in from sideways. And of course, this op-ed in the New York Times is dominating news cycles. So I think that he'd be happy to pull this off. Therefore, he's looking around for what can take it off the news cycle, and perhaps an NAFTA agreement would be it. Last week he kind of moved away. remember when we had Manafort and Mr. Cohen convicted, and then we suddenly got into other things. He's been a master at being able to manipulate the news cycle.
New day, new story. Mary Margaret on Twitter asked, why not walk away from NAFTA and use WTO rules?
Because first of all, the WTO itself is in a fairly difficult state. It's basically frozen. We've been negotiating now for 19 years on a trade agreement. The appellate body, the United States, is basically pulled its support away from that, and so that's not working as well. The best first shield for us remains the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA is WTO is second best, still important. And actually, it's interesting that you say this because we've launched an effort with like-minded to try and improve. What can Canada, which really is devoted to the rules-based system, what can we do with other like-minded nations, Australia, Chile, Norway, other countries, and to bring the WTO back and reform it and make it work better. But for now, the NAFTA is still our best means of protection and shield against the kind of protectionism that we're enduring from the United States.
Okay, just a reminder, everyone watching, if you are on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, just post a comment, ask your question, we'll try to get to all of them. Again, I apologize, I'm probably going to butcher every pronunciation here, but Saturn Javier or Javier on YouTube asks, how is Canada negotiating from a position of strength or not?
Well, this was not a negotiation that we sought. This was something that, remember, Donald Trump campaigns, NAFTA's the worst deal ever, I'm going to rescind NAFTA. The good news is he didn't rescind NAFTA, although if you read the Woodward book, it was clear that it was on the desk several times, but didn't happen. So the fact is we're still negotiating. But Mr. Trump has continued to put pressure on the fact that he's reached an agreement, even if a handshake agreement with Mexico, of which there's still a lot of details, puts some pressure on us because he's now given notice to Congress that he will have an agreement, whether it's bilateral or trilateral, by September 29th or 30th. So that puts a bit of pressure on us. But all this exterior noise, some of which we've just talked about, I think gives us some maneuvering room.
And Kit Mishra on Twitter asks, he asks specifically about some visas, but he also asks more broadly, what are the implications in case a NAFTA deal is not reached between the two countries?
Well, if we aren't able to reach an agreement by the end of, then what you move into kind of a period of question mark. But the president has not yet rescinded NAFTA, so the old NAFTA, the 1994 NAFTA, would remain in effect until the president decides to rescind it, and he gives a 6-month notice. So we're at least 6 months away from this NAFTA being rescinded. And then, of course, if he does decide to rescind at the end of the 6 months, unless he's got something to replace it, it may well be the Congress, because the Congress will intrude on this. Remember, it's the Congress that has given the president the authority through the Trade Promotion Authority to negotiate a new trilateral agreement. There's a lot of discussion now in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, saying that coming forward with only a Mexico-U.S. deal will not be sufficient because it does not accord to the Trade Promotion Authority. From a Mexican perspective, they've got to be careful because they could well find that Congress says, no, Trade Promotion Authority doesn't apply. We're going to negotiate even more with Mexico.
Okay. I think Katie Simpson is ready for us. Katie, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Give us a quick update before I start throwing questions at you. How's it going there?
Chrystia Freeland is in right now at the U.S. Trade Representative Office, where she's meeting with her American counterparts. And something unusual did happen today, Vassy and Colin. It actually has nothing to do with Chrystia Freeland. Robert Lighthizer, he is leading U.S. trade negotiations. He is overseeing everything from the Americans. To give you sort of a little color about him, he's a self-described curmudgeon. He doesn't talk to reporters, and we've seen him come and go from the USTR building over the weeks over time that we've been camped out in front of that building or at other rounds of negotiations. He's not one for small talk, and he's not one for chatting with reporters. But today, on his way in, not only did he make small talk with reporters about the weather, saying that he enjoys the hot weather, we asked him how things are going with Canada, and he said everything's great. I realize that is not groundbreaking, NAFTA changing, but it's a signal of how tone is going. Compare that to the Montreal round of NAFTA negotiations. A number of us were trying to scrum him when he was walking out of the building at the hotel in Montreal where the talks were taking place. He did not seem to enjoy that we were trying to ask him questions, and he pushed a security guard in front of him and yelled at him, "Walk faster," and pushed and ran. So there's a different tone there, at least from U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. And Chrystia Freeland seemed pretty optimistic heading into talks as well. She's been optimistic throughout this sort of process, but that's part of the Canada MO to try and stay publicly positive about this, despite whatever may be going on behind the scenes. Sources are telling me things are going, they're moving slowly, but progress is happening, so they say. But in terms of any sort of movement on the big key issues on like Chapter 19, the dispute resolution process, or procurement, government procurement's another issue that hasn't been sorted out yet, or Canada getting to carve out some protections for cultural productions and cultural industries. Nothing sort of, no drips or drabs are coming out just yet on that.
Okay, let me throw in a question then on that. I'll start with you, Colin, and get Katie to answer the same one. Dylan Smith on Facebook asks, in your opinion, would it be more advantageous for Canada to make concessions on Chapter 19 or supply management?
Supply management.
Why?
Why? Because I think we're looking at supply management with the wrong end of the telescope. I think that if you look at our beef and pork industry and our grains, all of these were protected at one point. We've opened them up over the past 25 years, but we haven't with our dairy and poultry industry. I think we can be as world beaters with our dairy and pork. When I was posted abroad, I used to bring in Canadian cheeses and serve them at receptions. People said, these are superb. Why can't I get them? Because we have supply management. We only produce for our own market. We don't really export it. I'm convinced that we could, in fact, I think we'd be a real threat to the Americans, given our capacity in Canada and the fact that we make a very superior product. But Chapter 19 we really need, because we do need some recourse from a very unpredictable and sometimes capricious American court system.
What do you think, Katie?
One way to sort of have an educated guess about what the government might do next is to look at decisions the government has made before. And in terms of what we've seen previous Canadian governments do with the last two trade deals that they signed on to, the trade deal with Europe and the trade deal with the Pacific Rim, we've seen some compromises on the dairy issue. The Americans, when they made their first demand, they asked for Canada to eventually dismantle the entire supply management system. Canada has said it's not going to do that, and Justin Trudeau would have to really, it would be a very clear example of a broken promise after saying for such a long period of time that Canada will not dismantle supply management. So I would not expect the government to make a massive concession like that to just dismantle the system. But if you take a look at what Canada has done in those two previous trade agreements, they have opened up more access to the Canadian market for farmers from other places. So don't be surprised if that's something that the Canadians do in this negotiation. Sources have told me that as of Friday, it's really funny, on Friday, the U.S. Trade Representative's office put out a statement saying Canada has not made any concessions on agriculture, which another word for agriculture is dairy. But when I was talking to some senior sources about that, one senior source laughed and said, really? They said that? Because apparently the negotiations are to a point where they're really hammering out those fine details as to what concessions will look like. So expect that.
We had the president of the dairy farmers last night on the show, and he was saying that no concessions are obviously accepted. But what was interesting to me is, though, that in TPP, the original TPP, the Harper government agreed to compensate them. And then the Liberals have sort of said, yes, we will too, but that money has actually never come through.
No, we didn't have to because, in fact, as Katie points out, we had negotiated with the United States. We were going to give them, I think, we were going to give them roughly the same access that we gave the Europeans under the Canada-Europe trade agreement. But because we didn't, the Americans, well, Donald Trump pulled out the very first day, we didn't have to spend that money, but that money is there. And undoubtedly, we're going to have to provide adjustment assistance. But again, as I say, I am convinced that we can be world leaders in dairy, just as we are in beef and pork, and as we are in our grains and lentils.
Okay, Jason Wiles on Twitter asks, if Canada and Mexico were granted temporary exemptions from steel and aluminum tariffs on the basis that NAFTA, at the time, that NAFTA talks were ongoing, if a deal were made with Canada being a part of it, do you think the U.S. would drop those tariffs now?
That's a big part of what we'll be negotiating. And the Mexicans have basically tried to negotiate that as well, that the steel and aluminum tariffs would lift when an agreement came in place.
Okay. Katie, Akmal Bazarov on Facebook asks, what negative consequences for Canadians may we expect if NAFTA, the new version, is not signed?
For the Americans, well, first of all, expect one of the first sort of consequences would be take a look to the markets. What's going to happen to the stocks of major companies that rely on NAFTA? What are the consequences going to be for the auto industry? Donald Trump has really, part of his message to his base is that he wants to bring back manufacturing jobs. And in the chaos in the moments after, if there is not going to be a NAFTA agreement, and if trading rules are going to go back to what they had been in the past, that would certainly cause a lot of uncertainty for a big part of Donald Trump's base. Those people who feel like they've been forgotten, have manufacturing jobs, used to have manufacturing jobs, want their manufacturing jobs back. That would certainly cause a lot of uncertainty for that sector, that entire segment of the population. So that could upset his base. That could cause some ruffling of some feathers for sure. But if Donald Trump went ahead and decided that, you know what, the United States doesn't want anything to do with NAFTA, if he has his staff draft up another letter or something of that nature, their look to the markets first would be my first sort of observation. And then look what's going to happen to the companies, the major employers in America that depend on trade within North America.
Seamus Paradis, Colin, on Facebook asks, since Canadian domestic consumption of automobiles is only 600,000 and exports over 3 million autos back to the U.S., what leverage and negotiations does Canada have when it comes to the auto sector?
It's the auto industry itself. Remember, we make an awful lot of parts as well. Mm-hmm. And it's a deeply integrated industry. To just build on what Katie said, my sense is the first industry that would squawk if this were to go would be the auto industry, because their costs would balloon.
Right.
These supply chains, which have been very carefully constructed. Remember, we've had free trade in autos since 1965, and you've got, on the American side, the auto workers, the parts manufacturers, and the big three all saying, do no harm to this, and the Canadian workers saying similarly. Remember, the Mexicans got into this long negotiation, which resulted in at least a handshake agreement, in part because we'd already agreed with the United States back in May to sort out rules of origin, which is a big piece of what the next agreement will be. And we'd agreed that we can move it to 75% North American content, and the labor threshold, that is the wage of $16 an hour, that's not going to bother Canadians because Canadian workers make average around $35 an hour.
Katie, Ronnie Boyko on Facebook asks, this is kind of interesting, I wonder if you've heard anything like this, does the imminent cannabis decriminalization / legalization in Canada complicate anything with NAFTA at all?
That's not come up in terms of my conversations with officials. I know that there are obviously some conversations on the public safety side, but in terms of how things are going at the table right now, from what I understand, the conversations are more focused on, okay, here's the deal we had, here's our ways we can tweak and modernize it. I think that is something that more public safety is dealing with, and possibly health department. However, in terms of my conversations with my sources, that has not, and any conversations I've had with American officials, that has not necessarily come up in the conversation. It's more the text of the agreement, what they have right now, and ways to modernize it for the digital economy. Obviously, Canada and the United States have and Mexico have very different approaches to marijuana, but in terms of the conversations I've had, that's not come up.
Okay, I just want to remind everyone that we are on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, so you can please send in your questions, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. There are some questions about the cultural aspect that's come up a lot this week, Colin. So Derek Green on Twitter asks, any information on film /VFX /animation subsidies? What is your understanding of the broader cultural issue right now?
Well, under the current, we have kind of a cultural exemption clause, and we also sought this in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So essentially, we're free to do what we like with relative impunity in the cultural sector. The government has put this back on the table this week. In fact, it seems to have supplanted the progressive trade agenda. My sense is it's probably tactical. The Americans will say, all right, you can probably have this, although they may push us a bit on telecommunications investment restrictions. But on the broad cultural side, I think they'll save it. Now, we've got to remember that if we do this, we also inflict some pressures on ourselves because, for example, movement of our performers back and forth, that's precluded a bit by the NAFTA because of our cultural exemption. And my sense is that you think Arcade Fire, you look at, you watch any of the number of Canadian performers that do particularly well in film and television and music in particular, we do well. So I think this is one that we be careful what we ask for because we actually are cultural world beaters.
What do you think, Katie, about the U.S. perspective on it? Is this a hill to die on for them, or is this just our red line?
Sources have suggested to me that perhaps the Americans, well, what the situation is, at least what I've been told, is that this was always an issue for Canada. It came up from the start. The Americans, in their 18-page demand list for what they wanted to see in a new renegotiated NAFTA, didn't have any specific demands directly related to this. Canada came to the negotiating table last year saying it wanted to keep the cultural exemptions, keep that carve-out so it can continue to have Canadian content rules, continue to ensure Canadian stories are told on big screens and little screens and don't get necessarily drowned out by Hollywood. And that's just one aspect of this cultural exemption situation. Even though Canada put that on the table early on, it didn't get a lot of attention. Sources tell me the Americans were grumbling about it little by little over the year of negotiations, but it never really came up as sort of a big issue. But as they go into this final last stretch of negotiations, it's one of the issues that remains unresolved. So it's also been suggested to me by some American sources that perhaps this is more a bargaining position for the Americans, that they're not necessarily too interested in this, but it's a way to have some power over Canada to try and get some concessions on other issues. But at this point, it's something that hasn't been resolved yet, and that could be why we've heard the government talk so much about it. And I want to point to something that Colin said, that this could be a way to sort of make sure that they get out there and say this new trade agreement is going to be progressive. Because you know what we haven't heard anything about lately?
Good point.
What about the gender chapter? What about the Indigenous chapter? What more about the environment chapter? A senior source told me, I want to say about a week ago, I was sort of asking some questions about that, and the senior source said to me, those progressive chapters are not going to get in the way of a renegotiated deal. So I'm not quite sure what the status of those chapters are. It's going to be a question when we get down to the nitty-gritty, but but it was suggested to me by a very senior individual that it's not going to get in the way of anything.
That's very interesting.
I think nice but not necessary, especially when we're down to things on market access. That's what really counts.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is something to them. I think over time, you think back labor and environment, when we did the original Canada-US Treaty, it really wasn't there. We brought it in as side letters in the NAFTA. I do think that with globalization, I do think there's something to this, but I think it's still going to take a bit of time to morph its way through.
Barry Crawford on Facebook asks, Colin, can Canada leave NAFTA and look to other markets like Asia, and Europe?
Yes, very much so. But we've got these two big deals in place. Katie talked about what we now call the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership with. It was actually an Obama administration initiative that took wing with, but then Mr. Trump rescinded it on day one, and so now we and 11 other countries are part of this. And these are important countries in Asia, Japan in particular. We've been always trying to seek access to the Japanese market. We now have it. We've now got the European Union market open. But to answer his question directly, the trick now for us, and what's really important for us, is to take full advantage of these. We've got these agreements, but we're not as good at realizing the potential of them. That is, getting in and selling and actually doing the deals on a business-to-business perspective.
Katie, I'm sorry that I'm trying to read the name. KND111488 on YouTube asks, what are the implications of a Canadian withdrawal from NAFTA on the Canadian economy?
Okay, I don't think. Okay, well, I don't.
Good question, yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think Canada is. That would be a big if. Justin Trudeau has said things like, no NAFTA is better than a bad NAFTA. At the end of the day, if Canada is the one that won't sign on, or Canada's I don't see the Canadian government actively withdrawing from NAFTA. It might be a position it's put in by the Americans if the Americans want to withdraw. I don't necessarily see that, but if there is a breakdown in talks, if there's a decision that the Mexicans and Americans are going to try to go on together, which is a complicated scenario because the Americans technically, Congress has to give the White House authority to negotiate a deal. The authority they have right now is to renegotiate a trilateral deal. So even if the Americans say, hey, you know what, Canada, we've had enough, we're going to go it alone with Mexico, see you later. The power is really with Congress because Congress didn't give them the authority to renegotiate a two-way deal. They gave it for a three-way deal. But there are still some legal questions about that. Well, maybe Trump can still go ahead. It'll be a test of his power, that kind of thing. But if something like that happens and Canada gets left behind, the consequences would be significant, first of all, for the auto industry, which is a very significant industry in Canada. There would be concerns for the dollar. Oh, that would be the first place you want to look. The markets, the dollar, because the supply chain is so integrated, there wouldn't just be consequences for Canada. There'd be consequences for all of North America. So you'd look to the markets, you'd look to the Canadian dollar, where it would probably take a significant hit. It would take a significant hit in the short term, could possibly balance back out in the long term, because remember, the Canadian dollar drops. It's good to attract business. More American businesses might do more of their work if they have facilities in Canada because they understand, well, you know, our dollar's pretty strong. We can do it pretty cheap up in Canada. And the labor standards are up in Canada pretty high. So you don't have that same sort of rub that American businesses get in the U.S., where they send their business down to Mexico and the labor standards are low, wages are cheap, and it causes it raises concerns about the ethics of that. So it's a complicated situation. There would be consequences for all three countries, but for things to watch for in Canada, what's going to happen to the dollar, what's going to happen to markets, and then take a look at the manufacturing sector. It's not as big and vibrant as it once was, but so many Canadian families depend on those manufacturing jobs. So there would be significant consequences.
Okay, final question, Colin. Mo Cabrera on YouTube asks, how would not making a deal, kind of similarly, impact investment attraction to Canada?
Well, the danger of not having a deal is that foreign investors look and say they want to get access to the biggest market in the world, and that's still the United States. And one of our selling points is that we've not only access now to those Asian markets through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and European markets through the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, but we also, with NAFTA, have access to the United States. So we're a good place to situate investment for the reasons Katie just outlined. We've got a very highly educated workforce. We've got all the resources. We've got relatively cheap energy, and we have that access to the United States. Without having that access to the United States, foreign investors may say, well, let's just put it in the United States. That's the danger of not having an agreement.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Thanks to Colin Robertson and Katie Simpson. That's it for our special Facebook Live, YouTube Live, Twitter Live. We hope we helped answer some of your questions, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. But we'll be talking a lot about NAFTA on our show tonight, and hopefully we can answer those questions then. That's from, of course, 5 to 7 Eastern on CBC News Network. Hope you can tune in. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Colin.
Vassy, thank
Great.
you. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.